So now you need to pick what software you want to use depending on which strand you're taking. For some strands, like woodworking, that's not going to be a big issue. There's not going to be a huge amount of software that you need to use. There's a few tools that might help you out, but most of your time is going to be spent in the workshop. For most of the other strands, at least part of what you do, if not all of it, will be based on the tools that you choose. And there are a lot of tools to choose from. So there's some key points to think about when you decide which tool you want to choose. One of those is how steep is the learning curve for this tool. So here's a graph to kind of visualize that. Some tools you can learn fairly quickly at the beginning and get up to a reasonably powerful level with that tool. And then there's probably not a lot more to learn with that tool. You've got it, and you can just keep using it at that level. With some other tools, they're really powerful, but that means that you've got to learn a lot before you can really start using the tool and get good at it. There's a lot of climbing to do, a lot of learning you have to go through in order to get to the point where things become easier and you start being able to just flow with that tool. Now, with a high learning curve tool or a steep learning curve, you're probably going to pick up some of the features and techniques in that tool very quickly, but there's still going to be a lot more learning to do before you can be productive than with a low learning curve tool. The trade-off there is that if you have an easy learning curve, most often those tools level off at an earlier point, and there simply isn't a whole lot more power to be gained by using that tool a longer period. Once you've learned it, you've got it, and that's all there is that you will be able to use. If you have a steep learning curve tool, most often those tools are very highly powerful. And the longer that you use them, the more that you're going to learn, and it will continue getting more and more powerful as you unlock more and more features in that tool. And that level at which you stop having to struggle so much to learn it and start becoming really productive when you sit down right away is generally much higher than with the easy learning curve tools. That's not true for every tool, and these curves are a simplified story. It's usually much more complicated than this for any tool. Parts of it are much harder to learn than others, for example. But this is a general picture. Is it generally a steep learning curve tool, a hard learning curve, or is it a easy learning curve for that tool? That's one thing to really think about when you look at these tools. If it's something that you're just interested in, you might want to start with an easy learning curve tool. If it's something you're sure you're interested in, you're going to want to be doing this for many, many years, or maybe the rest of your life because it's a career that you want to get into. You probably want to start investing the time in that learning curve now so you can get to the point where things become easier and you get productive. All right, another thing to think about is where does that tool come from? One kind of tool that you can get is called a free open source software tool, or FOSS. And this is one of the icons for FOSS. Introducing FOSS, the penguin, because Linux's icon is a penguin. That's where the penguin comes from. Free tools are great because you don't have to pay for them. They generally have the easier learning curve and the lower power limit. You just can't do as much with them in a lot of cases. Free open source software tools, on the other hand, full FOSS, not just free, often are free, but they're also really powerful. And in many cases, they also have a high learning curve, just like some of the paid software does. Paid software most often has a really high learning curve. It is not at all like FOSS it's not at all like the free softwares in that it is generally steep, period. When you're paying for it, people want the high power, which means they're willing to do the trade-off and do the work to learn the tool. Now, you'll probably hear a lot of people in the world talk about free open source software versus the closed source Microsoft, Apple, proprietary things as a battle between these. It's not really. It's just a different choice. What are you interested in? One of the trade-offs with free open source software is that there's a giant community of people out there using it who talk to each other online. That also generally means there's not somebody that you can call on the phone to say, hey, I bought this software from you and it's not working, can you help me? There just isn't, you didn't buy it from anybody. So there's not a company that will support the software for you. In some cases, you can buy a support contract from somebody. Many cases, you just go online and ask your question in the community and somebody responds and tries to help you out, and people work with each other that way. Another trade-off there is that the proprietary softwares, the paid softwares, sometimes have security restrictions or bugs, or not bugs. I forgot the word I was going to use there, but they have limits on where and how you can use that software, how many computers you can install it on, which kind of computers you can install it on. Free open source software generally doesn't. A third thing to think about, in addition to the power curve or the learning curve for that software and what kind of software, open source, free, proprietary, would be, is it online? Again, the big trade-off on online tends to be that the power curve limits at a lower spot than the proprietary local softwares. They tend to have a much higher, and the free open source local softwares tend to have a much higher limit on the power than the web-based softwares. The upside of the web-based software is that it is web-based. You can get to it from any web browser anywhere. Your files are there ready for you to go. You don't have to depend on any particular computer running. You don't have to depend on any particular piece of software working with everything else that you've installed in the computer. It's just in your browser, and it works. So now there is a large list that you need to look at here. Depending on which strand you're interested in, you need to go in and decide, what software am I interested in working with? Is it online? Is it local? Is it easy learning curve? Is it a higher learning curve? Is it a hard learning curve? How much power am I going to be limited to by making that choice, at least initially? And do I want to support free open source software? Do I want software that's paid? You'll notice all the ones that are paid on this list you can get for free because you're a student at CAC. But when you leave CAC, you may have to pay for that software. Now that you've learned it, maybe that's worth it to you. Or maybe you want to choose free software because you might have to pay for it someday. These are all things to think about as you choose which piece you want to invest your time in learning.